At first blush, these verses would seem to fulfill all of the worst stereotypes that modern critics of Christianity have about the Apostle Paul. After all, many modern readers would look at these verses and say, why doesn't Paul just simply forbid slavery outright? We need to remember that Paul wasn't speaking to a Roman audience in general, or even to an Ephesian audience in general. He was speaking to the church. And I think the closer that we look at these texts, what we will find out is Paul was not naive about his social environment. He wasn't naive about the structures and systems that made up that environment. Rather, Paul was a keen observer of his society. And he was a thoughtful pastor. Now let's begin our exploration of this text by trying to bridge some horizons here, trying to build some understanding, both for Paul and for his modern critics. Okay? Now I want us to start that part of our discussion this morning with just a little exercise. I want you to close your eyes just for a moment, not long enough that you fall asleep, but I want you to close your eyes and imagine that you are standing in the middle of a prairie. As far as your eye can see, there is nothing but grassland. Now, that's going to be a big, wide picture, isn't it? Because you can see all the way to the horizon. But what we know is that what you are actually seeing is only a small portion of the world's surface. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that this is all you had ever seen. Not only would the word mountain not mean anything to you, but there wouldn't even be a word for it in your language, would there? Now you can open your eyes. That's the insight that the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer brought to this process of interpreting texts. We all stand in a particular place. And the problem is that we think we can see everything, when in fact we can only see so far. There were lots of people in the ancient world who probably could not have even imagined a world without slavery. Okay? But before we get to that, let's talk about why Paul's critics might have reason to be so frustrated. We have said here before that slavery was the engine that ran Rome's economy. It was the thing that made Roman economics and perhaps even society go. Okay? We've even said that if you wanted to advance socially, one of the few ways that you could do it is through slavery, if you could get yourself enslaved to the right person. That's a big if. The problem is that perhaps we have painted too rosy a picture of slavery in the ancient world. Slavery stripped a human being of his or her identity. You were no longer you. fact, I was just sitting here thinking about how a lot of slaves would just simply be named secundus, second, or third or fourth or whatever, right? You are stripped of your identity because your identity is subsumed within the family that owns you. Now, that doesn't just strip you of your identity, but it tears you away from your heritage. You are no longer the product of your family. And it tears away from you your posterity, because your children, as long as they are born in slavery, are not really your own. They are not really your own. Now, as you can imagine, that can do terrible, terrible things to a person. I don't think we have properly appreciated the ways in which that kind of dislocation can malform a person's character. And then remember what we've always said. Malformed character has a way of replicating itself down through the generations, right? Because we learn how to be human from watching other humans. Now, there's another aspect of slavery that we need to think about. Slavery was built upon domination. It was built upon particularly physical domination, but there were other forms too. We'll talk about those in a moment. And again, you learn how to be human from watching other humans. The problem is, when you are on the receiving end of cruelty after cruelty after cruelty, that starts to frame your understanding of what it means to be human. Right? Slaves were regularly beaten, not just for disobedience, not just for insubordination, but oftentimes simply for not getting the job done. Right? But the violence wasn't just physical. As we've talked about before, it was sexual. Your master, as a slave, owned you. They could do anything they wanted to you. And by anything, I mean anything. There was no recourse. You had no control over your own body. But the violence was also social. One way that they could punish you as a slave is to sell your wife or your children. Now remember, you can't legally marry because you're property. But it's funny, humans have a way of organizing themselves into family units, even when they're not allowed to do so. That's what slaves would do. They would have what were the equivalent of marriages. And one way that a master could punish you is to sell your wife, your children. These people that you love the most are torn away from your life. And on top of all of this, many people assumed that slaves lacked a key capacity, if you will, for being human. The capacity for rationality. Now, when people assume that other people are not truly human, they tend to treat them as if they are not truly human. In fact, very often, they treat them worse than most of us would treat our pets. Slavery was even in the first century, a bitter, dark, demoralizing institution. And many of Paul's critics know that very well. And they stand in the shadow of their own generational sort of consequences, downstream consequences from slavery. I remember an African-American gentleman that Natalia and I knew. He lived in our apartment complex. We really liked him. Nice guy. He was telling us about one time when he was 16, he had managed to get a 21-year-old woman up into his bedroom, and his father came home and found him. Yeah. And his father beat him and threw him down a flight of stairs. And his father's response was, if you're going to act like a man, I'm going to treat you like a man. But there was a certain brutality to it. So oftentimes we humans indulge in self-fulfilling prophecies. We treat people like they aren't human, and then we have the nerve to be surprised when they act like they're not human. Now, what's really weird about this, from my point of view, is that at one level, Roman society should have known that what they believed about slavery wasn't true. It should have broken that bond that they had created in their composite mind between nature and society, because slaves were manumitted, not all the time, not frequently, but a lot, much more than in the American South. You would think that would have broken that bond, but another thing that we humans are really good at is we're really good at ignoring the cognitive dissonance in our social environment. If it's in our interest to do so, we just ignore it, even though it doesn't make logical sense. So I think we can understand why Paul's critics are frustrated. But I want us to also look at things from Paul's point of view. And I think in doing so, we can address some of those frustrations. Because not only do we need to address this text from an apologetic point of view, that is, from the point of view of defending the gospel, we also need to move beyond that and say, okay, how does this text apply to our lives? So what do we need to understand about the Apostle Paul? Well, we do need to understand that he writes from a position of social privilege. Paul was not an elite, but he was a man of relatively high status. That tends to shape, in a lot of ways, how we look at the world. But what I think is more important is that for Paul, the goal of everything that he's doing, particularly in Ephesians, we've seen this all along the way, is unity. Paul is working with the Ephesians to help them stay united as a group of people, as a collection of people. And these people come from a variety of ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay? So for Paul, unity is really important. Now, I didn't put this on the screen here for you, but one more thing it's less apparent in Ephesians, but one thing that I think is important to Paul is that Paul also wants to protect the community from external criticism. Okay? I think that's an important thing for Paul as well. He wants to make sure that the community doesn't look to be something that would be threatening to the Roman Empire and Roman officials. And we may come back to that in just a moment. Now, those two facts are important. But there's another fact that might be even more important. And you have to kind of put on your theology hat here to think about this. This is not something that your average social scientist is going to notice. But it's actually very, very important. Yes, Paul believed that God's sovereignty had something to do with a person's social location. Okay? But, and this is a huge, you put but in capital letters, but Paul did not ascribe a person's social location to divine displeasure, and he did not assume that if you have a particular social location, there's something wrong with you. Okay? Now that's really important for us to see. Paul does not simply assume that because you're a slave, you can't think. Okay? We've seen that all along the way, haven't we? When he's talking to women, he treats them like human beings. Even when he's talking to children, Paul may not get as complicated as he does when he's talking to women or slaves, but he's still talking to children like they are human beings, like they have the capacity for moral agency. That is very, very important and unusual in Paul's day. Okay? Now, one more thing that we want to kind of observe about Paul. And this goes back to that whole, Paul not wanting to create problems for his community thing again. Paul preferred subversion rather than revolution when he saw socially problematic systems and structures. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. One we've already mentioned. Paul wanted to protect the community, and he wanted to keep the first things first, the gospel first. But I think there's another reason. And I think it's deeply rooted in Paul's own theology. Paul assumed that this present evil age, Galatians 1:4, is passing away. He assumed that the structures and systems that animate our world are at the very least ephemeral. Many of them are corrupted. Okay? And so for Paul, he's not surprised when he looks around and sees social systems or structures that are just ungodly. That does not faze him. He's not surprised by that. But he also doesn't feel the need to engage in some revolutionary overthrow of those structures and systems because he knows they're passing away. He knows they don't really matter. You're a slave in this life? So what? That's not going to mean anything in the next life. That doesn't mean anything to God. We're going to come back to that again in a few moments because we're going to see where Paul makes that argument. Okay? So for Paul, what he wanted to do is he wanted to sort of maintain the appearance of Roman respectability while at the same time undermining, subverting that same system, that system of respectability. So I'll give you an example. I heard just this week, Sho Baraka works for Christianity Today right now, but he's been a Christian rapper. He's been a minister, as an MDiv from Duke Divinity School. He was on the Bulletin podcast, and he was talking about masculinity and how you help men understand that shaping, or sharing, I should say, not shaping, sharing their emotions doesn't have to be unmanly. And he said, look, if I walk into the hood, and let me tell you something, Sho Baraka has credibility when it comes to the hood. I mean, he just does. He just oozes credibility. But he said, if I walk into the neighborhood and I say, hey guys, hey fellas, gather around, we need to start sharing our emotions, they're going to look at him like he has lost his ever-loving mind. So what does he do? How does he approach it? He comes up with a creative way to sing about it or rap about it. And even there, he doesn't attack it frontally. What does he do? He pokes at it. He pokes them. And he asks hard questions, right? He asks difficult questions. And it's in asking those questions that he's then able to subvert these structures, these systems. That's a model that Paul would want us to emulate in so many areas of our lives and our Christian witness. Okay, now we've kind of established where Paul's coming from, and we've established where Paul's critics are coming from. Okay, and what we're trying to do, because what Gadamer said you have to do, is you have to bridge those horizons, because oftentimes the horizons don't come together; they don't overlap. It's like I'm standing in France and you're standing in Australia. We're not going to be able to see the same territory, right? Not even close. So you had to create a bridge. Well, that's what we've been doing. But now we want to turn to the actual text. We want to see what Paul actually says. Okay? And the first thing we want to do is we want to look at what Paul says to slaves. And just like when he's talking to children, Paul talks to slaves more than he does to masters. But there's a lot that he wants to unpack here. Even though it's in just a few verses, Paul wants to unpack a whole lot here. The first thing that he says is, slaves, obey your masters. But then he unpacks that by explaining what he means. Okay? And there's at least two participles that he uses to explain this. And he wants them to work diligently, and he wants them to serve wholeheartedly. Work diligently, serve wholeheartedly. I think it's there in verse 6, where he's talking about, not just when their eye is on you. That it translates a single word that used to be rendered eye service, I think in the KJV. And we all know what Paul's talking about there, because we've all worked in environments where we were not the boss, right? And you've seen different people take different approaches to the job. Some people, they are literally in the job only for what it can give to them. But that's not how we as Christians are. We as Christians believe that work is of intrinsic value. And so we work. We don't just work when the boss is looking at us. We work. We realize, and it doesn't matter. I mean, I used to work in a grocery store, folks. There was work that needed to be done. There were customers who needed to buy milk. I needed to get the milk out on the shelf. Even though it wasn't good for them, there were customers who wanted to buy Coca-Cola. Well, so did I. So I had to get it out on the shelf, right? And even if there wasn't stock to get out, I needed to make the shelves look a certain way so that customers could easily find what they were looking for. There's value in that. It's not, curing cancer or ending hunger or bringing world peace, but it's valuable. But Paul goes a step further than that. Paul doesn't even have to make that argument because he goes a step further. His argument is you want to be a person of integrity. We're going to come back to that in just a second. You want to serve as if you were serving Christ himself, because that's what you're doing. You are Christ's slave. So you want to serve. And you can tell by the way that Paul unpacks this whole thing of obeying that slaves are responsible for more than just, hey, go scrub that plate. Sometimes the command given to them is much more complicated. Sometimes that command is, hey, keep my kid out of trouble. Yeah. Hey, train this child to do geometry. Hey, you see that group of slaves over there? Make sure they get this field harvested, right? Okay? Paul wants the slaves that he's addressing to work as if they were working for Christ, because the way that they work reflects not only on them, but on him. Right? Now, Paul also, in this passage, unpacks certain dispositions, certain virtues. We've already talked about one or two of them. He wants them to be sincere. He wants them to be diligent. He wants them to be hardworking. He wants he's got all these things that he wants them to be. He wants them to show integrity, right? The last thing that Paul wants slaves doing is robbing their masters. He wants them to display a certain suite of characteristics that reflect well upon the gospel. Not just because they reflect well upon the gospel, but because they actually reflect the gospel itself. The good news is that we don't have to live a self-serving, self-centered life. That is part of the good news. It's one that sometimes I think we Americans forget, but that is part of the good news. We don't have to live a life that is so selfish that we are always pretending. We're always putting up a mask. We're always trying to put one over on somebody. We can be who we really are. I love that saying, comfortable in your own skin, because it defines a particular kind of person. But that isn't all that Paul does. We tend to read these verses as, simply Paul saddling the slaves with a heavier burden even than other slaves had. But actually, that's not all anyway of what's going on here. Paul is also setting limits on this institution. He might even be delegitimizing it. Let me show you what I mean. Look there in verse 25. The New International Version says, obey your masters, your earthly masters. That's how they render it. Obey your earthly masters. Right? Now, that word earthly translates a phrase, according to the flesh. Now, that phrase could simply substitute for an adjective. Fleshly masters, earthly masters. Sometimes flesh was used that way. But I think it is, there are other ways Paul could have put that phrase. I think Paul's actually trying to make a point here. I agree with Lynn Cohick that Paul is, at the very least, limiting the duration of this arrangement. And he may very well be assigning it to a subordinate, even an evil classification. Your masters according to the flesh, not according to the Spirit. Right? And wherever possible, Paul wants us living according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh. Right? Okay? So Paul is already poking the bear, so to speak. He's already saying, and he's doing this while he's addressing slaves fully in the hearing of their masters. Now, it's one thing for Paul to say that to the masters outside the slaves' hearing. It's quite another thing for Paul to do that while he's talking to the slaves, and the masters are just overhearing it. Paul is at least saying, these guys, these girls will not always be your masters. We'll come back to that in a moment. The other way that Paul does it is, notice what he does there in verse 8. He's telling them, hey, do all of this stuff. Do all this stuff that I'm asking you to do. Serve wholeheartedly. Work diligently, because God rewards everyone. There is this implication of divine impartiality. Divine impartiality. Very, very few, maybe even not any, but certainly very few thinkers in the first century world would have thought of this issue in that way. They would have assumed, of course God cares more about what the elites think, about what the owners think, about what's good for them. They're the ones, after all, who have the power, right? Yeah, I accept that. Paul agrees with Jesus that the kingdom of God is upside down compared to the world's logic. If you live in a city like Corinth that values worldly wisdom, what's God going to do? He's going to turn that upside down, and he's going to say, no, I'm going to reveal my will to children, to use Jesus' language. I'm going to choose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. If you live in a society like Philippi, a Roman colony, a place that was crawling with current and retired Roman soldiers, supposedly manly men, men who had killed. What's he going to do? He's going to say, no, actually, this Jesus, who is God, and therefore could have made every one of you just disappear. Every atom in your body could have just gone. What does he do? No, he humbles himself. He humbles himself so thoroughly that he is born into a non-elite family and is crucified. The most shameful method of execution available in the Roman Empire. He is crucified. Now, that's a really good place to turn our attention to the masters. Lynn Cohick puts it this way. She says that Paul's words to the masters are brief and severe. What does Paul do? Well, he directs them to treat their slaves in a way that is commensurate with the instructions that he gives to slaves. It's not easy to interpret exactly what Paul means when he says, treat your slaves in the same way. But he does. I mean, is a master supposed to serve his slave? Maybe. But at the very least, I think Paul is taking that list of virtues we talked about, diligence and sincerity and integrity and hard work and all that kind of stuff, and he's applying it to masters too. What if masters in the first century worked hard on their slaves' behalf? How would that produce a powerful counter witness to the narrative that Rome was selling? Remember what we said at the beginning of all of this. In the Roman mindset, the head, his job is to preserve himself at all costs. Because if you've got a head, you can always get a body. You can't do the other. Problem is, that's not how Paul thinks. It's not how Jesus thought either, by the way. Paul is, in fact, asking masters, not asking really, telling masters, you better treat your slaves in the same way that I've instructed them to behave towards you. Then Paul denies the ultimate legitimacy of the institution. What does Paul say there in verse 9? It's kind of the third little grouping of words there. What does Paul say? He says, for the one who is both their master and yours is in heaven. We are all slaves, is Paul's point. You may think that you own human beings in this life, and the Roman government may back you up, but when you stand before the throne of God, you will be held accountable. You will be held accountable. So, how does Paul say that slave owners should respond? Well, for one thing, Paul takes away, he removes the primary mechanism for ensuring good slave behavior. In other words, don't beat your slaves, don't threaten your slaves. Paul is demanding of masters the same vulnerability that was inherent to being a slave. Because if a master decides that he's not going to beat his slaves anymore, if he decides that he's not going to threaten his slaves anymore, they could just run wild. And what Paul is saying is, yeah, they could. But they'll be accountable to God for that. Your job is to do what's right. Why? Because now Paul doubles down on what he made implicit when he was talking to slaves. He makes it explicit here. The one who is their God and yours will judge, and he shows no partiality. God is impartial. He does not take sides. He is not, the NIV or the KJV used to call it, he's no respecter of persons. It's weird. That's kind of it's an archaic phrase, and it could mislead people, but I kind of like it for some reason. I don't know why I like that little phrase, but he is no respecter of persons. You are not going to walk before the throne of God and say, well, I was a Roman praetor, or I was Bishop of Milan, or I was executive director of the Baptist General Convention of Texas, or the president of the Southern Baptist Executive Committee. That's not going to happen. You're not going to, none of that matters. Jesus is not impressed with your resume. Okay? It is so easy to forget how radical that idea was and how important it is supposed to be in shaping our own behavior. Now, let's turn our attention to applying this text to our own situation, okay? And let's begin by talking about slavery. Let's dispense with that issue right away, okay? Paul does not, in this text, give us a clear overturn of the institution, but here's what he does. He guts it of its meaning and power. And any institution that is gutted of its meaning and power is destined to fall. So, abolitionists of every era, from the 4th century Asia Minor to 19th century North America, are right in asserting that slavery is ultimately an unchristian institution. It cannot be sustained, not in any form that has existed in human history. It cannot exist. And frankly, I think what Paul would say is, stop trying to save it. Stop trying to save it. And oh, by the way, while you're at it, why don't you examine some other structures like debt prison or indentured servitude. Now, we don't have those either in the United States, but it's important for us to keep saying, this is why we do what we do. This is why we do what we do, because this is what God has taught us to do. And while we're at it, we need to be supporting people like International Justice Ministry and others who are working to set people free from modern day slavery. Because even though slavery is illegal, both in terms of United States law and the United Nations, you got to remember, according to IJM, 2 billion with a B people in the world live without the protection of law, which makes slavery not only possible but likely. And we've seen it all over the world. Just this week, there were a couple of yahoos arrested in the North Texas area because their plan was to get a whole bunch of guns, get on a sailboat with a few guys they picked up from who knows where, and invade an island off the coast of Haiti, take over the island, kill all the men, and make slaves of the women. I would not have believed it if I didn't see the news story myself. Are people really this depraved? Apparently the answer is yes. And they didn't just sort of get online and talk about, hey, this is what I want to do. They actually started taking steps to acquire the necessary skills and equipment to do it. So there is still work for us as Christians to do in helping people understand that slavery is absolutely, utterly impermissible. That it is to never be defended, and that it is to always be abolished. But let's go a step further. What about implications from this text for our own social life, for our life as a people? We need to remember that all of us have obstacles to our spiritual life. We all have obstacles we have to overcome. And a lot of those obstacles are spelled S-E-L-F, self, right? Virtues like diligence and sincerity and hard work and even obedience can be helpful in enabling us to overcome ourselves. They don't solve everything, okay? And sometimes the enemy uses those kinds of virtues for his own purposes. But what they can do is they can habituate us to a life of thinking about others and thinking about the church before we think about ourselves. But having said that, let's remember that those of us who stand in a position of social superiority are under a greater obligation to rein in our selfish tendencies. You remember James says that not many of us should want to be teachers because teachers will be judged more severely to a higher standard. Well, obviously that's because teachers know more, but it's also because teachers have more. They have more status, they have more power, and they can do more damage. There is nothing so difficult to overcome as a soul who has been wounded by a religious or spiritual authority. There is nothing so difficult to overcome. And so for those of us who carry the title pastor, minister, deacon, titles of various sorts, or for those who have positions of power in the workplace, our job is to live in accordance with the gospel. It is to live in accordance with the gospel. Because remember, one of the things Paul cares about is unity. And one of the things that undermines unity is when one member of the church is abusing others in their secular, supposedly secular work. There's no such thing as secular work in the kingdom of God. We are all working on behalf of Jesus, no matter if we are washing cars, operating on brains, or translating Greek texts. We are all working on behalf of Jesus, and we all have responsibilities to live in accordance with the vision that Paul articulated for the Ephesian church. Let us pray.